Christchurch mosque massacres that widely circulated on social media just a few months earlier. A video he reportedly cited as inspiration for his deadly attack in a 2,300-word racist manifesto that he also posted online. And on January 6, 2021, we saw a stark example of how individuals went beyond seeing and sharing extreme content across numerous social media platforms. They were spurred to action by what they repeatedly saw online, and ultimately a mob violently attacked Capitol Police and breached the Capitol building. In attack after attack, there are signs that social media platforms played a role in exposing people to increasingly extreme content and even amplifying dangerous content to even more users. Yet there are still many unanswered questions about what role social media platforms play in amplifying extremist content. We need a better understanding of the algorithms that drive what users see on social media platforms, how companies target ads, and how these companies balance content moderation with generating revenue. For the majority of social media users who want to connect with distant family and friends or stay up to date on their favorite topics, there is very little transparency about why they see the content, recommendations, or ads that populate their feeds. And while social companies have promoted how they are providing more curated content for their users, we have seen how users can be shown increasingly polarizing content. In worst-case scenarios, users are reportedly recommending more and more extreme content, nudging them down a dark and dangerous rabbit hole. Recent reporting and congressional testimony and revelations in the Facebook papers have shed some light on business models that appear to prioritize profits over safety, and decisions that appear to disregard the platform's effect on our homeland security. It's simply not enough for companies to pledge that they will get tougher on harmful content. Those pledges have gone largely unfulfilled for several years now. Americans deserve answers, and how the platforms themselves are designed to funnel specific content to certain users, and how that might distort users' views and shape their behavior both online and offline. As part of my efforts to investigate rising domestic terrorism, including the January 6th attack, I've requested information from major social media companies about their practices and policies to address extremist content, so that we can better understand how they are working to tackle this serious threat. And while we're continuing to work with companies to get answers and examine relevant data, I'm looking forward to hearing from our experts today about how these platforms balance safety and business decisions, and specifically how these decisions relate to rising domestic extremism. Ranking Member Portman, you're welcome to start with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate your holding this hearing. It's a very important topic, and I look forward to hearing from our experts today. And then I think in a future hearing from some of the companies themselves. The role that social media plays in directing content that can lead to online and offline harms has taken on new significance in the past several weeks, as we've learned more about this from whistleblowers and others. And news has emerged about malfeasance by some of the largest internet platforms. This exploitation of social media, of course, is not new. In 2016, as chair of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of this committee, I held a hearing which examined the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS's use of online platforms in furtherance of their violent goals. We learned from testimony that social media accelerates, in this case, ISIS radicalization and recruitment efforts, and can also speed up their mobilization to violence. Today, foreign terrorist actors continue to try to weaponize social media to inspire radicalization and attacks against Americans and American interests. This use of social media for nefarious purposes is not limited to terrorists, of course. Drug traffickers, foreign adversaries, and a host of other threat actors exploit online platforms, particularly social media. China and Russia use these platforms to conduct influence campaigns targeting Americans, including being involved in our elections. Drug cartels and gangs use these platforms to traffic narcotics. Traffickers use these platforms to exploit children and other vulnerable people, and domestic violent extremists across the ideological spectrum use social media to spread propaganda and recruit members to their cause. So it's a broad problem. Social media platforms acknowledge that these threats exist, and they talk about what they're doing to prevent bad actors from exploiting their sites, including artificial intelligence, to help moderate content, networks of cross-industry partnerships, and on-staff experts. Some of you have maybe been in that position, all to prevent or remove dangerous content. However, there is still a persistent threat of harmful content despite what the platforms say they're doing. These social media companies are businesses, so it's not surprising that Congress and others have trouble getting more information on their algorithms and how they operate, how they're designed to amplify content. That's proprietary information, I understand that. But Congress has heard from whistleblowers, like Frances Haugen recently, that Facebook has not addressed troubling aspects of its algorithms, which have promoted a variety of concerning and alarming posts. This raises important questions about whether or not it is time to revisit the immunity provided by Section 230. In 2017, during my time as PSI chair, I introduced legislation which would remove Section 230 immunity from platforms that knowingly facilitated sex trafficking. So we have dealt with this issue. That legislation, called the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, or SESTA, was actually signed into law back in 2018. We figured out how to deal successfully with Section 230, at least in this one narrow area, but very important area. I take advocates, researchers, and even platforms at their word when they call for regulation. But regulation can take many forms, which puts a premium on having sound information and analysis as we consider legislation to solve these problems. In other words, we need to know more. We need to be able to look under the hood and figure out what the issues are to be able to regulate properly. These experts are in front of us here today to help evaluate the extent of the problem and also discuss what we should be doing about it. So far, we found out a lot about social media business models from third-party researchers and from whistleblowers. The findings are largely based on anecdotal evidence. If they want to ensure that Congress pursues evidence-based policy solutions, I think it's incumbent upon the platforms to provide quality data. I'm already working with Senator Coons, who's chair of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Privacy, on legislation that would require the largest tech platforms to share data with legitimate researchers and scholars so that we can all work together on solutions to these problems that all of us have identified. Dr. Persley has been an important partner in this work, so I look forward to his testimony today. Importantly, as we look at these issues, we must take care that our efforts hold these platforms accountable, but it's done in a manner that balances First Amendment protections, which I understand Professor Franks is going to discuss in her testimony. Mr. Chairman, again, thanks for having this hearing, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I thank you for giving us a chance to have real experts in front of us.
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman. Well, it's the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses. So if each of you will please stand and raise your right hand, including those who are joining us by video. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Yes.
You may be seated. Our first witness today is the Honorable Karen Kornblue, former ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and who currently serves as a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where she leads its digital innovation and democracy initiative to ensure technology supports democracies across the globe. Prior to her role with the German Marshall Fund, Ms. Kornblue served in previous administrations as Chief of Staff at the U.S. Treasury Department and of the Office of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs at the Federal Communications Commission, where she negotiated early Internet policies. Welcome to the committee. You are now recognized for your 5-minute opening remarks.
It's supposed to light up. Thank you, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and committee members for the opportunity to testify on this critical issue. To underscore the points that you both made, the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terror states clearly that the widespread availability of domestic terrorist recruitment material online is a national security threat. I'd like to stress 3 points today. First, the design of the platform and its algorithms can promote radicalization. Second, this cannot be addressed by after-the-fact whack-a-mole content moderation. And third, we need to change the platform's incentives so that they fix these dangerous design elements. As part of a test, Facebook researchers created an account for a fictional Carol Smith, a 41-year-old conservative mother from North Carolina. Within days, Carol was recommended pages related to QAnon, and within only 3 weeks, the platform showed her an account associated with the militia group 3%ers. She didn't ask to be shown this content, she had no idea why she got it, and she had no idea who was paying for it. Facebook groups can be manipulative as well. Internal research found that a full 70% of Facebook political groups in the US were rife with hate, bullying, harassment, and misinformation. Facebook's own algorithms recommend extremist groups to users. For instance, Facebook directs users who like certain militia pages towards other militia groups. The platforms also provide tools that help extremists to organize. So-called super inviters can create invitation links to groups that can be shared on or off Facebook. The platform provides inviters recommendations of specific friends to invite, allowing them to recruit from other conspiracy and militia groups. As an example, Stop the Steal inviters sent these kinds of automated invitations to members of other groups, resulting in high membership overlap with Proud Boy and militia groups and fueling Stop the Steal groups' meteoric growth rates. This is a national security vulnerability. It was recently revealed that 140 million Americans were targeted by troll farms operating out of Eastern Europe. Similar algorithmic radicalization is evident on other platforms. TikTok's algorithm, for instance, also promotes content from QAnon, the Patriot Party, Oath Keepers, and 3%ers. YouTube has 290 extremist channels. When researchers showed an interest in militant movements, YouTube suggested videos to them with titles like 5 Steps to Organizing a Successful Militia. The platform also recommended videos about weapons, ammunition, and tactical gear. Extremists find it all too easy to work across platforms. Diehards can organize on less moderated platforms like 4chan or Telegram, and then they retail the fringe content on more mainstream platforms with just a few clicks. Second, the whack-a-mole approach to catching content after it's gone viral can't work. Facebook employees themselves admitted this problem. They said that the mechanics of the platform were behind the hateful speech and misinformation, but most of their ideas for changing these in order to limit algorithmic radicalization were rejected. The content moderation system can't win against huge volumes of algorithmic recommendation, but that system is further undermined by exempting many users with large footprints. No wonder that at Facebook, the researchers said they catch only 0.6% of content that depicts violence or could incite serious violence. Third, it's critical to change the platform's incentives. While Congress works on more comprehensive legislation regarding privacy and antitrust, a digital code of conduct could help tackle algorithmic radicalization while protecting free expression. Congress or the FTC could demand platforms commit to common sense design changes and transparency, and the FCC would enforce the company's commitments. Platforms should implement the kinds of design changes that research has already shown would enable more consistent application of their own terms of service. For example, a circuit breaker like those used by Wall Street to prevent market crises could prevent the viral spread of sensitive content in topic areas with high harm potential, while human reviewers have time to determine whether or not it violates platform policies. Second, platforms should commit to transparent third-party audits, the equivalent of a black box flight data recorder, like the National Transportation Safety Board gets when a plane goes down, or the data available to the FDA or the EPA. We shouldn't need a whistleblower to access data. Third, the FTC should enforce commitments to this code under its Section 5 Consumer Protection Authority. Of course, Section 230 reform, as contemplated in a number of current bills, would also allow users to sue in cases of terrorism or serious harm, or they could require a code as a condition of limited liability, but this would require legislation. Mr. Chairman, the whistleblower's documents are a look in the rearview mirror, but Web 3.0 is being built today. It's essential that we act now to set sensible rules of the road, and I thank you for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Kornblue. Our next witness is Dr. David Sifri. He's the Vice President of the Center for Technology and Society at the Anti-Defamation League. Mr. Sifri leads a team of innovative technologists, researchers, and policy experts developing proactive solutions and producing cutting-edge research to protect vulnerable populations. Additionally, Mr. Sifri is an advisor and a mentor for companies and was selected as a technology pioneer at the World Economic Forum. He joined the ADL after a career as a technology entrepreneur and as an executive at companies including Lyft and Reddit. Mr. Sifri is also an advisor and mentor for companies and was selected as a technology pioneer at the World Economic Forum. Welcome, Mr. Sifri. You are recognized for your opening comments.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Portman, members of the committee, good morning. It's an honor to appear before you today to address the ways social media platforms amplify hate and foment domestic terrorism. For over a century, ADL has been a leading voice in fighting hate in all forms, and we've been tracking online hate since the days of dial-up. In 2017, ADL launched our Center for Technology and Society to respond to the threat of online hate. My team advocates for targets of online hate and harassment. We deeply engage with and call out tech platforms to hold them accountable for their actions and their deliberate inaction. Before joining ADL, I spent my career as an entrepreneur and executive in the tech sector. A trained computer scientist, I founded 6 technology companies and served as an executive at Lyft and Reddit. I have been on the inside, and I know firsthand how big tech companies work and how business incentives drive product, policy, and strategy. These platforms maximize profits by providing hyper-targeted ads to an audience that spends large parts of their life online. Core product mechanics like virality and recommendations are built around keeping you, your friends, and your family engaged. The problem is that misinformation, hate-filled and polarizing content is highly engaging, so algorithms promote that content. As ADL's own research has long suggested, and Facebook leaks confirm, these platforms exploit people's proclivity to interact more with incendiary content, and tech companies do so with full knowledge of the harms that result. Ultimately, these companies neglect our safety and security because it's good for the bottom line. With no accountability, no regulation, and no incentives beyond growth and increasing ad revenue, extremists find a haven to reach, recruit, and radicalize. Platform algorithms take advantage of these behaviors, especially to our attraction to controversial and extremist narratives. As a result, some users get trapped in a rabbit hole of toxic content, pushing them towards extremism. This has deadly consequences. ADL reports show that extremists on mainstream platforms push people into fringe communities that further normalize hate and violence. Extremist ecosystems inspire individuals to commit acts of domestic terrorism, as we saw in Charlottesville, Poway, and El Paso. Senators, 3 years ago yesterday, in what was the most lethal anti-Semitic attack in American history, 11 congregants were massacred at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Before he attacked, the terrorist posted his anti-Semitic manifesto, which then spread online and was expressly cited as inspiration by the Poway and El Paso shooters. How many lives will be lost before big tech puts people over profit? The leaked Facebook documents revealed that company researchers flagged Facebook's key role in spreading conspiracy theories, inciting extremist violence, and contributing to the events of January 6th. Company executives were fully aware of the problem and chose not to act. Self-regulation is clearly not working. These billion and trillion dollar companies billion and trillion dollar companies have the resources to improve systems, hire additional staff, and provide real transparency. Yet they claim it's too burdensome. Without regulation and reform, they will continue to focus on generating record profits at the expense of our safety and the security of our republic. The leaked Facebook documents, January 6th, and rising domestic terrorism all confirm what ADL has been stating for years. Social media is a super spreader of the virus of online extremism. It's time for a whole of government, whole of industry, whole of society approach to fighting online hate. ADL built the Protect Plan to address the rise in domestic extremism and our Repair Plan to push back hate to the fringes of the digital world. Congress must establish an independent resource center to track online extremists and make appropriate referrals, regulate platforms, including through targeted Section 230 reform, ensure academic researchers access to data, and require regular and meaningful transparency reports and independent third-party audits. It is well past time to hold social media platforms accountable. Thank you for your leadership in working to bring an end to this cycle of hate.
Thank you, Mr. Sifri. Our next witness is Dr. Kathy O'Neill, the CEO of Orca, an algorithmic auditing company that helps companies and organizations manage and audit algorithmic risk. As an independent data science consultant, Dr. O'Neill works for clients to audit the use of particular algorithms in context, identifying issues of fairness, bias, and discrimination, and recommending steps for remediation. Dr. O'Neill earned a PhD in math from Harvard, was a postdoc at MIT Math Department, and a professor at Barnard College. She has authored the books Doing Data Science and Weapons of Math Destruction, How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. Welcome, Dr. O'Neill. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm in a lucky position of just being sort of a background expert here. I'm going to try to explain three things. First of all, what is an algorithm? Second of all, what is a recommendation algorithm? And third, what is a filtering algorithm? Because those are the two types of algorithms that you see the most on social media. But I'm just going to start with what is an algorithm. I'm going to do the opposite of what most people who talk about AI and big data will do. I'm not going to try to make it complicated. I'm going to try to explain it in simple terms because it is quite simple. It is predicting the future, predicting what will be successful in the future based on patterns in the past. What was successful in the past. And it doesn't even have to be formal. It could be something you do in your head. Like, for example, I cook dinner for my children every day. I look for patterns in the past. That's historical data. Well, historical data is just my memories. I know what this kid eats. He only eats carrots, but not broccoli. That kid will eat raw carrots, but not cooked carrots. I have a lot of information, and I can predict what will be a successful dinner. But here's the thing that's really important. Besides the historical data I'm talking about is the definition of success. I have to be very precise when I do make an algorithm. And I have to say exactly what I mean by success. And in this case of making dinner for my kids, I'm going to define success as my kids eat vegetables. And the reason it's so important to how you define success is because you actually optimize to success. So I'm going to make meals that are likely to be successful. Time after time, I'm going to learn from my past mistakes or successes, and I'm going to make meals that will be successful in the future. Now, I just want to make the point that a different choice of success changes everything. So if my son were in charge, he's a fan of Nutella and not so much of vegetables, then we would have very, very different meals. We would be optimizing to Nutella rather than optimizing to vegetables. So just imagine what kind of meals that looks like. It's completely different. So I just want to make the point that algorithms depend a lot on patterns in the past, but they depend even more on what you define as success. And I'll make a last point about algorithms just in general, which is like whoever is in power, whoever owns the code, typically is the one that defines success. And I would say to the points I've already heard, success for social media platforms is about money. They're always going to optimize to money, which is, of course, ad clicks. And so now we're going to talk about recommendation algorithms, which is how social media decides what content to show you or what groups to offer you membership for. So I want you to think about this. I want you to think about your behavior on these platforms are just it's a sort of scoring system. Like you have scores in multiple dimensions. Actually, let's start not with social media platforms, but let's start with like Netflix. Let's say you watch Die Hard, the movie, twice a week, every week. Then you're going to be scored in multiple ways by the platform. And you, for example, you'll be scored along the lines of, do you like male characters in your movies or female character in your movies? Do you like violent movies or non-violent movies? Do you like suspenseful movies or non-suspenseful movies? And if you watch Die Hard twice a week, your sort of male character, violent, suspenseful movie scores will go up every time you do it. And every time you watch a movie that's like a chick flick, a romantic comedy, those scores will go down a little bit and romantic comedy scores will go up. So you should think about your profile from the perspective of recommendation algorithm as just a series of scores along these various dimensions that profile you, like what is your taste? Now, for the definition of success of those algorithms, the point is that they want you to stay on the platform as long as possible. For social media algorithms, the definition of success is, again, staying on the platform as long as possible. They will profile you and score you in all sorts of ways to figure out how to keep you on the platform. So I just want to make the point that this is completely neutral so far. They would likely score me as very interested in crafting and yarn in particular, and they would offer me yarn type things, and every time I click on them, my yarn profile score goes up. So they would peg me more and more over time as somebody quite interested in yarn. And in that sense, I would become an extremist with respect to yarn. So every single person is sort of nudged and profiled with respect to their interests. And I would even add that it's not just what they're interested in initially, but they can become more interested in certain things over time because of the content that's offered them. So similarly, if I watched Die Hard enough on Netflix, I would be offered more and more movies like Die Hard, and that would actually inform my profile and my tastes in the future. I would spend time a little bit on filtering algorithms, but it just suffices to say that whereas recommendation algorithms work quite well for the social media platforms, and they make them very profitable because they do succeed in keeping people on the platforms, the opposite is true for filtering algorithms. The idea of getting rid of harmful content, they do not work well at all. They're very, very facile, sort of keyword search-based algorithms, and they are quite unsuccessful compared to recommendation algorithms. And I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Neill. Our next witness is Dr. Nathaniel Persily, the co-director of Stanford Cyber Policy Center and the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. Dr. Persily's scholarship and legal practice focuses on American election law. He is a co-author of the book Law of Democracy. His current work has been honored as a Guggenheim Fellow, Andrew Carnegie Fellow, and a Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, examining the impact of changing technology on political communications, campaigns, and election administration. Dr. Persily, you may proceed with your opening comments.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Portman and members of the committee. I'm going to spend my time today talking about what we know, what we need to know, and then what to do about it. Before I do that, let me just sort of admit what we all know, which is why we're here. And that is that a courageous woman revealed thousands of pages of documents that previously no one had seen outside of the company. The revelations themselves, the content were quite striking, but the fact that she did it was really momentous. And it sort of brought front and center the fact that the internal researchers at these companies know an enormous amount about us, and we know very little about them. And that is an equilibrium which is not sustainable, right? We cannot live in a world where all of human experience is taking place on these platforms, and the only people who are able to analyze the data are the people who are tied to the profit-maximizing mission of the firms. And so, as Senator Portman mentioned earlier, I've been working both with his staff and others, trying to figure out a way to open up these companies to outside research because they have lost their right to secrecy. Right? We're at a critical moment where we need to understand what is happening on these platforms. So let me talk about 3 areas of critical importance when it comes to research on online harms. The first is how much harmful content appears on these platforms. The second is the role of the algorithm, and the third has to do with advertising. So first, how much harmful content is there on these platforms? And the answer is a lot. Right? If you listen to or read the transparency reports, there are millions of examples, whether it's hate speech or disinformation or inciting content and the like. But those numbers are really quite meaningless. So is the claim that, for example, Facebook takes down 4 billion accounts a year. I mean, that's interesting because it seems like a lot. But none of us really know what the denominator is. We don't know how much of the offending content is being shared and viewed by users of the platform, and what the experience is, both of the average user and certain subsets of users. And so for most people, it's quite sort of important to understand their experience online is not filled with hate speech. It's not filled with disinformation and the like. But that is also the wrong question to ask. The question, and where I think research has progressed in the last few years, is to suggest that there's a sizable minority on these platforms who are experiencing and producing an enormous amount of this terrible content, whether we're talking about incitement, hate speech, disinformation, and the like. And particularly because these are folks that it's going to be very hard to survey, it's going to be very hard to get them in sort of outside strategies for research, we need the internal data to figure out exactly what's going on. Secondly, on the role of the algorithm. So this is an area where the platforms and outside observers seem to have diametrically opposed views. Whether it's the Haugen revelations or others that from Facebook who have made this point, or even conventional wisdom, the argument is made that they're maximizing for engagement, and salacious, disinforming, and hateful content it generates the most clicks, and therefore that is what's favored in the algorithm. If you ask the companies, they say no, that there are all kinds of measures that the firms are taking in order to take down this offensive content, that they take down, as I said, millions and millions of examples of hate speech and the like. I will say one other point that they make is that on encrypted platforms such as WhatsApp and the like, that you see the same types of offending content. And if you go outside the United States, where those kinds of platforms are much more ubiquitous, and they don't have algorithms, that you see as much, if not more, of the hateful content. Finally, let me talk about advertising. These firms are advertising monopolies, and we need to treat them as such. That is what makes them distinctive. We don't really know a whole lot about how advertising is affecting sort of this information ecosystem problem that is the subject of this hearing. We know, of course, about the meddling in the elections, incendiary content, whether it's from Iran, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, and the like. But even when outside researchers try to study advertising, as a group of NYU researchers tried to do, they were kicked off the platform because they were trying to scrape and to try to find out exactly how people were targeted and the like. So now what to do about it? So there are many areas of reform that I think are on the table. Karen Kornblue mentioned some important ones. I want to focus on this question of researcher transparency. We cannot live in a world, as I said before, where the only people who understand what's happening on the platforms are the internal researchers to the firms. Whether it's immunizing outside researchers who want to scrape the platform, as these NYU researchers do, or to develop a secure pathway, maybe administered by the FTC, in order to vet researchers so that they can analyze privacy-protected data, that has to be our future, right? We cannot live in this world where the platforms hide behind their right to secrecy. Only if we can get access to this data can we then regulate intelligently. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final witness this morning is Dr. Marianne Franks, who is a professor of law and a Michael R. Klein Distinguished Scholar Chair at the University of Miami. Dr. Franks is also the president and legislative and tech policy director of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating online abuse and discrimination. Her work is at the intersection of civil rights and technology. Dr. Franks authored the award-winning book, The Cult of the Constitution, Our Deadly Devotion to Guns and Free Speech, and has been awarded a grant from the Knight Foundation to support research for a book titled Fearless Speech. Welcome, Dr. Franks. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Thank you. On October 14th, 2021, Facebook announced a new artificial intelligence project called Ego 4D. The name derives from the project's focus on egocentric, or first-person, perception. Among Facebook's plans for this data include equipping augmented reality glasses with the capacity to transcribe and recall recordings of what people say and do around the user. Asked whether Facebook had implemented measures to address potential privacy and other abuses of these capabilities, a spokesperson replied that the company, quote, expected that privacy safeguards would be introduced further down the line. As underscored by multiple internal documents recently released by whistleblower Frances Haugen, this approach is characteristic of Facebook, aggressively pushing new, untested, and potentially dangerous products on the public and worrying about the consequences later, if at all. Documents shared with the SEC note the asymmetrical burden on employees to demonstrate the legitimacy and user value of harm mitigation tactics before implementation, a burden not required of new features or changes aimed at increasing engagement or profit. While it may no longer be an official motto, move fast and break things still seems to be Facebook's animating philosophy. It is notable that Facebook chose to announce such a highly controversial new project just as the company faces a storm of criticism and scrutiny over documented evidence that it knowingly allowed of violent extremism, dangerous misinformation, and harassment to flourish on its platforms. One might have expected Facebook would be more circumspect about drastically increasing the capacity of individuals to record people around them without consent, in light of the revelation, for example, that it allowed nude images of an alleged rape victim to be viewed 56 million times, simply because the man she accused of raping her was a famous soccer star. Is it arrogance? Is it callousness? Or is it merely confidence? Confidence that no matter what is revealed about Facebook's role in the disintegration of our shared reality or the dissolution of our democracy, not its acceleration of conspiracy theories from QAnon to stop the steal, its amplification of deadly disinformation about COVID-19, its endangerment of teenage mental health, its preferential treatment of powerful elites, or its promotion of violently racist and sexist propaganda, that it will face no real consequences. After all, that seems to be the lesson that not only Facebook, but other dominant tech companies have learned from previous scandals. Media attention will be intense for a while. They may be called before Congress to answer some uncomfortable questions. They may face some fines, but the companies will reassure the public that their purpose was never to cause harm, and they will promise to do better in the future. It should be clear by now that debates over tech companies' intentions are a distraction and an obstacle to real reform. Moral and legal responsibility is not limited only to those who intend to cause harm. We hold entities accountable also when they know their actions will cause harm, or when they are reckless about foreseeable harms, and even sometimes when they are negligent. Facebook and other tech companies have known for years that a business model focused on what is euphemistically called engagement is ripe for exploitation and abuse. These companies have, at a minimum, consciously disregarded substantial and unjustified risks to Americans' privacy, equality, and safety. These risks are not politically neutral. Contrary to oft-repeated claims that social media is biased against conservatives, the algorithms of major social media sites disproportionately amplify right-wing content. Facebook allows right-wing news sites to skirt the company's fact-checking rules and changed its algorithm in 2017 to reduce the visibility of left-leaning news sites. The day after the 2020 election, 10% of all views of political content on Facebook in the United States were of posts that falsely claimed that the vote was fraudulent. As one Facebook employee wrote, if a company takes a hands-off stance for these problems, whether for technical or philosophical reasons, then the net result is that Facebook will be actively, if not necessarily consciously, promoting these types of activities. According to recently released internal research, Twitter's algorithms also disproportionately amplify right-wing content. Research on YouTube's algorithms show that they create a far more robust filter bubble for right-wing content than left-wing content, and that Fox is by far its most recommended information channel. Influence that illustrates how the ecosystem of extremism and disinformation is driven by forces beyond social media. Lopsided political amplification is all the more troubling given the disproportionate rate of right-wing offline violence. Since 2015, right-wing extremists have been involved in 267 plots or attacks and 91 fatalities. To be clear, the object of concern here is not conservative content as such, but content that encourages dehumanization, targets individuals for violence and harassment, traffics in dangerous disinformation, and promotes baseless conspiracy theories that undermine our democratic institutions. Social media, along with, in some cases, mainstream media, elected officials, and others with influential platforms, amplify these anti-democratic forces. Structural reform, including reform to Section 230 that limits its protections to speech protected by the First Amendment and denies immunity to intermediaries who exhibit deliberate indifference to unlawful content, is necessary to ensure that no industry and no individual is above the law when it comes to the reckless endangerment of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Franks. Recent reports based on the leaked Facebook papers indicate that Facebook was certainly aware that changes that they made to their newsfeed configurations spread dangerous content more rapidly. Each of our witnesses have mentioned this in one form or another already. Yet company leaders repeatedly argue that they are investing in trust, safety, and civic integrity efforts. I'm certainly struck, as I think you are, by this fundamental conflict between efforts to take down hateful and violent content and company algorithms that seem to amplify extremist views simultaneously. Mr. Sifri, can you speak to this apparent conflict? You've mentioned in your opening comments, but a little more in depth, if you would, please. And how successful can these social media companies be at content moderation if they continue to design their own platforms to amplify extreme content?
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for that excellent question. I think it really cuts to the heart of the conversation here, that at its core, what we're talking about is the incentive systems that drive this business model, a business model that is based around getting you engaged. And when, unfortunately, the natural human biases that we have towards engaging with controversial, with polarizing, with content that makes us afraid, with incendiary content, what happens? Well, all of those indicators that were talked about earlier, right? Likes, shares, retweets, you name it, that those indicators go up. And so these platforms, Senator, are working as designed. What that ends up happening is that we end up spending more time on those platforms and they end up tracking us more. And then they get to send us more hyper-targeted ads. So this won't change until there is a clear shift in the incentive systems that they use to be able to do this business. And that's where Congress must act, in creating systems that actually bring about a change in their incentive systems. That's how we end up getting them to behave rationally in this sense, right? And move towards those different incentive systems.
Ambassador Kornblum, just to follow up basically on that question, in your opinion, can investments in trust and safety ever overcome a business model that prioritizes advertising revenues based on extremist content and the desire to keep people on a platform as long as possible?
I think it goes right to the heart. Oh, sorry. I'm not sure does that work? Okay, thanks. That goes right to the heart of the question. The algorithm is this machine that's pushing misinformation or extremist content into users' feed. It's recommending these extremist groups. It's targeting small groups of people with ads designed to agitate them. It's the mechanics of the system that are working. And then these poor human content moderators or even outmatched AI systems, as Dr. O'Neill was talking about, don't stand a chance. So their own data shows that less than 1% of content that depicts violence or could incite violence is caught. This is content that violates their own terms of service. And this is true. There's new revelations today about even something that was a high priority for Mark Zuckerberg, which is catching COVID misinformation. Apparently, they're unmatched at the content moderation even there. An international vaccine expert that I talked to told me he was so frustrated because he felt that the disinformation purveyors were working with the motor of social media and that the public health officials were fighting against the engine of social media. And I always think of, if you'll excuse this vision, I always think of that I Love Lucy skit when she and Ethel are on the candy conveyor belt and they're desperately trying to, go as fast as a conveyor belt. These content moderators just don't have a chance.
Well, I want you to continue on this line of questioning, Ambassador. Earlier this year, a report found that Facebook was posting ads for body armor, gun holsters, and other military equipment right next to content promoting the 2020 election misinformation and news about the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. So getting this content and ads for military equipment. What do we know about how Facebook and the platform targets their advertising and this kind of link? Can you talk to me a little bit more about what you are finding?
Yeah. And this is, there's so much here and it's overwhelming and it's hard to get our heads around this advertisement of these kinds of weapons. But there are three ways in which ads in general drive extremism. First, it's very different than what we think of in terms of cable and broadcast ads, where they're micro-targeted specifically to the people who would be most moved by them, and other users who might object, who might say, oh, that's violent, or oh, that's wrong, they don't get to see them. And the ad content isn't reviewed by humans before it's placed, so as they are on broadcast and cable. And thirdly, users can't really find out who's paying for these ads. Even political ads can just list a dark money group instead of their true sponsor, which could be a foreign government. So in 2016, remember, there were ads paid for in rubles that got through because there's no human monitoring this and there's very little transparency. And then as we've talked about, the algorithms are designed to maximize this ad revenue. So the ads are driving the whole thing. They're keeping you online to be fed the ads. And the incendiary content keeps users on the platforms longer. And then there's this third element that I think it's really important to think about. The algorithms that are trying to keep you online to feed you these ads, they're creating a marketplace that values extremism. So the more extremist the content, the better the distribution will be. The cheaper the ads will be, actually. It's a cheaper ad if it's more incendiary per unit because it gets wider spread distribution. So it's creating this marketplace. Political parties apparently came to Facebook and said, your algorithm is driving us to put out more incendiary content because it's the only way we can get distributed. If we just put out our 10-point plan, it doesn't get distributed online. So the ads are really the heart of this matter.
Well, thank you. The buzzer you heard is a vote, so we're in a series of votes. You'll see members running in and out, and that's what I will do. I will go and vote. I will recognize Ranking Member Portman for his questions, and Senator Hassan will chair the hearing in my absence. Ranking Member Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. So this is a really complicated area, and I'm glad that Dr. O'Neill gave us a little 101 on algorithms and how they work, and ultimately, she came down to the conclusion that this is about money. This is about what works, kind of along the lines of what Ambassador Kornblue just talked about, that, what works is what sells more advertising, and these algorithms are at the core of that. In other words, they are determining what we want to hear as online participants and amplifying that. I will say two things that I just want to try to stipulate here at the start, and some may not agree with me, but it seemed to me, Ambassador Kornblue, in your comments in particular, you were focused on right-wing extremism as being the problem. It's not. It's everything. And I hope we can agree to that because, again, the work that we did early on in this committee with regard to what ISIS was doing online and in terms of recruiting and spreading violence and in terms of what happens today even. I mean, there is, as you know, a lot of concern about these platforms not allowing what happened at the Wuhan lab, the leak, to come out, or concerns about what Hunter Biden is doing or not doing being blocked, or other things that lead me to believe that, whether it's Antifa on one side or whether it's white supremacy on the other side, we need to look at this as a problem that is impacting ideologies across the spectrum. So I'm just going to stipulate that because I want to get to some questions. Some of you may not agree with me on that, but I think that's really important for us not to make this a partisan exercise. Second is the First Amendment, and this is impossible. How do you figure out what is speech that is peaceful expressions of points of view that we should be encouraging, and what is content that ought to be, filtered in some way? And there's lots of examples of this. Recently, parents at a school board meeting by, I guess it was the National School Boards Association, said these are domestic terrorists. They aren't domestic terrorists. These are parents trying to, and I think they later apologized for saying that, but parents expressing their strongly held views about their kids' education. So you got to be sure that we're not taking content which is people expressing political views that are peaceful and somehow filtering those out. Any thoughts on that as we start for any of the panelists, either with us or virtually?
I just want to agree with you. The algorithms aren't partisan. The algorithms are economically driven, as Dr. O'Neill said, and they're just trying to keep us all online. And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And I think for the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, freedom of association, it's extremely important that the government not be in the business of deciding what's true and what's not true. And that instead, that's why I think some of these revelations from the whistleblower is so important, because she focuses us upstream of the content, at the mechanics of the platform, and how it's driving this content just to service itself and to service its ad revenues. And if we focus on those design elements and we focus on transparency especially, that furthers First Amendment concerns. It furthers freedom of speech and freedom of association. Transparency is such an important principle. If we let consumers know who's behind what they're seeing, what interest is it serving? Well, and that
leads me to my core question today, really. Again, just stipulating this is a hard area, and we've talked about a couple of those issues, but it seems to me that, as I said earlier in my opening statement, getting under the hood and looking into what these design elements are that you talk about, the transparency issue you talk about, is really important because, again, it's proprietary information. I understand that. These are private companies. Again, this is not an easy issue for government to be involved with, but everybody's talking about regulation right now. I mean, everybody. Facebook is talking about it. Google's talking about it. Twitter's talking about it. We're talking about it. Everybody has a different view of what that regulation might be, but shouldn't it be based on better data? Because we really don't know what we're trying to regulate if there is a lack of transparency as to what that design is or how these algorithms are derived. So, we talked a little, again, in your testimony about this. Dr. Pursley, in particular, you talked about your thoughts on how to give access to impartial researchers to be able, I assume, to publish about what is actually behind all this. What is the content directing mechanism and how does it work? Now, I'm intrigued by that. I don't know if that's the answer, and you mentioned that the FTC could play a role in this, Federal Trade Commission. But can you amplify that a little bit and talk about what you think could lead us to more transparency and better understanding?
Thank you for that question. So the model that I've put out there is that the FTC, working with the National Science Foundation, would vet researchers who would not have the permission of the company, but the company would have to basically develop research portals for outside independent research to study all of these societal problems that we are saying are caused by social media. The key features of this are simply that the firms have no choice in who has access to the data, and then we have some way of vetting the researchers to prevent, say, another Cambridge Analytica and the like. And so we need to have some process in place so that someone other than those who are tied to the profit-maximizing mission of the firm get access to this data. As you mentioned, it's proprietary data, but it's data about us, right? It is essentially data about everything that's happening in American politics and frankly, around the world. And so we need to figure out some way for the firms to be opened up so that outsiders can see it. My view is that they shouldn't turn the data over to a government agency, that would pose real privacy and surveillance problems. We want to make sure that there's a vetted, independent third party that's able to do this kind of research on all of these questions that have come up today, so that we can get to this answers to the questions about some of the questions that you asked earlier about the propensity on the left and the right to engage in hate speech or engage in violent content, as well as potential bias in the content moderation platforms and the like. Only if we have access to the data can we really answer those questions.
And otherwise, very, very hard to come up with regulation, which is what, again, everybody is talking about. I know there's different views on what that means, but it seems to me that there should be a consensus that if we're going to try to regulate this, we need to have better information as to what, what the actual design and what the intentions are and the impact is. So this hearing is helpful, I think, in that regard. I'm at the end of my time. Hopefully we'll come back for a second round if so many other questions for this team. But again, I thank you for your expertise today.
Well, thank you, Senator Portman. And it's now my turn for a round of questions. I want to thank Senator Peters and Portman for holding this hearing, and to all of our witnesses, both in the room and virtually. I really appreciate your testimony. This is an excellent panel, and I appreciate your work very, very much. I want to start with a question to Dr. O'Neill and Dr. Priscilli. I'm concerned that extremist groups, including ISIS, continue to develop and refine online radicalization techniques that make it easier and quicker to radicalize people. At this committee's annual threats hearing in September, leaders from the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and the intelligence community expressed similar concerns. Extremists take advantage of the speed of social media platforms, but also their algorithms, which often facilitate the quick spread of extreme content. So Dr. O'Neill and Dr. Priscilli, in your view, what are the weaknesses in the algorithms used by large social media platforms that can make it possible for anyone, including violent extremist groups, to expand and capture their audience? What steps can social media platforms take to curtail extremist efforts? And why aren't these companies taking these actions already? And I'll start with you, Dr. O'Neill.
Thank you for the question. Yes, and it's an important one. So I want you to think of the filters, these things that are trying to catch content like that is hateful or otherwise not allowed, as sort of nets that fishermen use in the ocean. They sort of pull the net and they see what they've got. And they've got some fish there, and they count the fish and they say, oh, we've got a lot of fish. What they're not counting, of course, is the fish that got through the holes of the net. So what I'm talking about are the people that who are paid actually to put hateful content on Facebook and elude the nets. The thing about it is that they can tell when they've been caught, and then they will redouble their efforts to change their content somewhat so that it gets through the net. It's kind of like if you think about the early spam on Viagra that would filter into your email. And then, the spam filters got rid of the things that said Viagra. And then they started saying Viagra, but it's spelled, instead of with an I, it was spelled with a 1. And those got through for a while until they didn't get through. So spam filters work pretty well to remove Viagra ads. And in part because Viagra is the same word over many years. But in the case of social media, the stuff that they're putting on social media changes very, very quickly, and the spam filters essentially cannot keep up. And it's a real, I think you should think of it as an arms race. It's the filters on the one hand owned by the social media, and of course the people that get sent the high score, like high risk content, and have to decide whether it is in fact against policy. And then on the other hand, all the propagandists who are actively trying to evade the filters. And the simple truth is that the propagandists are winning that war. To the extent that social media companies can combat it more, it would require much more expensive work, and they simply don't want to do it. So their policy has been, we're going to count how many fish we got. We're not going to count how many fish we didn't get, and we're going to hope that it sounds good enough for you guys to stop asking questions.
Thank you. Dr. Persili?
So this is one of those areas where I wish I had the answer. And in order to get the answer, we do need to have access to the data. I will say that, having talked to many of the integrity teams at these companies, these are pretty sophisticated operations that they've stood up in the last 5 years. And there's more that they could do. And as bad as things may be in the U.S., by the way, there are a lot worse around the world. And that's something that I think naturally we're focusing on problems unique to the U.S. But if they don't have the competencies in the local languages around the world, especially if you're dealing with terrorist content and the like, then they're going to be hindered in their ability to really attack these problems. Again, if you look at the work that we've done at Stanford, if you go to the Stanford Internet Observatory, we've been trying on the outside to flag this kind of content, the violent content, terrorist content, and foreign election meddling and the like. And so we've been trying to do on the outside what they do on the inside, but it's extremely difficult.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Franks, the proliferation of non-consensual intimate imagery, sometimes called, quote, revenge porn, is a pervasive problem on the internet. There are a number of truly despicable sites dedicated to hosting that material, but often users also share these private images and videos on large social media platforms with absolutely devastating consequences for those whose images are shared without their consent. Congress and the states have taken notice of the tremendous harms from these situations, and there is some work going on to address the problem. But what more should social media companies be doing to prevent this content from being hosted on their platforms and to more immediately remove it when found? What additional tools could these companies give to people to help ensure that their images are not shared on social media platforms?
Thank you. Social media companies, I will say this about some of the more dominant companies, have been trying to tackle this issue, Facebook among them. There are teams at all of these various companies that are quite concerned about these issues and have worked with organizations like mine, the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, to think about ways to impose their content policy restrictions and to encourage people not to participate in this kind of abuse and to try to empower victims to be able to remove the content. That being said, those kinds of measures are essentially putting victims at the mercy of these companies. They may choose to make this a priority. They may choose to impose some sort of policies, but there isn't any necessary reason for them to continue doing so. And tomorrow they could simply stop. So I think it really is important for the work that is being done by the state legislatures and by Congress. The SHIELD Act is included in the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2021 that would federally criminalize non-consensual pornography. That would be a real incentive, I think, for these companies to take it seriously. This is connected to what I've suggested about Section 230 and also goes to the broader question of incentives, about transparency or about regulation, about any of these questions. So long as these companies enjoy essentially blanket immunity for these harms, there is no real incentive for them to do anything. And therefore, it would be very important for there to be changes in Section 230 to take away some of that preemptive immunity.
Thank you very much. Again, I appreciate the testimony of all of you. I'm going to recognize Senator Johnson now for his round of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, let me say, anybody who's watched the social media, the documentaries, The Social Dilemma and The Creepy Line, I think has to understand that this can do great harm, particularly to children. I think as a result, I think our first line of defense is with parents. I think that they need to really do everything they can to make sure that their children aren't affected by this in a negative fashion. Ms. Franks, you made, or Professor Franks, you made the comment that it seems like, from your standpoint, most of the bad content leans toward conservative and that type of misinformation. I would just ask you, what is your assessment in terms of the leadership, the people who work in these companies? How do they lean politically in your assessment?
I'm not sure that it's relevant. I think
Pardon?
I'm not sure that that is relevant. The particular individual leanings of employees.
Okay, others can determine what's a relevant question or not, but let me just ask you again, what political affiliation do you think most people in leadership positions and that work in, whether it's Facebook or Google or Twitter, are they right-wing extremists? Are they conservative? Are they liberal? Are they radical leftists? I mean, what part of the political spectrum do you think they fall on?
Perhaps you could explain to me the relevance, and then I could answer the
Can
question.
you speak a little bit louder?
Sure. Perhaps you could explain to me the relevance of political affiliations of individual employees.
Well, I will say, just listening to testimony here, it seems like the big concern here is about right-wing extremism, which I completely condemn, or right-wing misinformation. So again, I would just argue, when you take a look at what Mark Zuckerberg has done through his Center for Tech and Civic Life, a couple $100 million spent, pretty well took over the election system, I think in violation of Wisconsin law, of Green Bay and 3 or 4 other cities. It doesn't seem to me that the impact or the intent of their manipulation of data would tend to favor conservative groups or conservative thought. It seemed to make more sense that they would tend more to push a liberal ideology.
Well, as other experts have testified, the main issue for most of these companies tends to be profit. And profit is usually going to be built around engagement. Engagement is usually going to be built around outrage, misinformation, half-truths, things that provoke people into thinking that they are under attack, that they are being victimized.
Okay, we heard that in testimony. Let me ask you, have you heard of the work of Dr. Robert Epstein?
I'm not sure.
So I saw somebody shake their head. Is that Mr. Persili?
Yeah, I am familiar with it, yes.
You're familiar with it?
Yes.
Can you summarize it, or should I summarize it for you?
Whichever you prefer, but yes, that he makes the argument that the platforms favored the Democrats in.
Well, he makes the argument that through manipulation of search, Google, as it ramps up toward elections, starts manipulating the search to push users of Google into the type of information that is going to tend to have you vote or decide to vote for a Democrat, delivering, according to him, millions of votes to Hillary Clinton, millions of votes to congressional Democrats in elections in 2018.
Yes, that is what he says.
Okay. I think the point I'm trying to make here is I think manipulation is potentially going to swing both ways. And who is going to be the arbiters of truth? You know, Professor Franks, you said that the reckless endangerment of democracy. Now, I would happen to think that if one of these platforms is utilizing their awesome power of manipulating search to turn votes toward one political party versus the other, if one of these tech giants spends hundreds of millions of dollars to turn out voters in Democrat-leaning areas and regions, that certainly impacts our democracy. You know, I'll give you another example in terms of Facebook. I provided a forum for people who were vaccine injured to just tell their story. Following that, there were about 2,000 people involved in groups supporting each other. Some of these women had such severe vibrations from the vaccine injuries, they committed suicide. So this Facebook group was a support group. It was literally helping people prevent suicides. Within a week, their group grew from 2,000 to 5,000 people, at which point Facebook dismantled the groups, and these individuals who are counseling and helping prevent suicides lost contact with the people who were suicidal. So who is going to regulate this? How is free speech different when it's on a platform versus when it's just spoken in the town hall?
Well, I would suggest.
Who is going to be the unbiased arbiter of truth? I don't think it exists. Now, I'm certainly questioning the 230, Section 230 liability protections when you have these platforms acting as publishers, which is what they are doing when they censor primarily conservative thought. I've been censored myself repeatedly. So again, I'm just pushing back and challenging the fact that this is, something that is fomenting right-wing conspiracies and highly advantageous to the conservative movement. I would say, if anything, it's more likely it's from a political realm, advantaging left-wing ideology. But again, I'll come right back to, we have a Constitution that protects free speech. Who is going to regulate that fairly in an unbiased fashion? It's just not possible. And along the way, we're violating people's constitutional rights. Anybody want to just take a stab at that?
I would be
one?
happy to respond to that. That yes, we do have a First Amendment. We do have a right to free speech, but we also know, of course, that private companies are not obligated under the First Amendment to take all comers. They are allowed to make their own decisions about what is considered to be high quality or low quality content. They can make any number of decisions, and I think we would applaud them in many cases to make those decisions. As we were talking about just before in terms of non-consensual pornography, I, for one, am very happy that Facebook has made the decision to say that that is not welcome on their platform. When it comes to the questions of conservative versus liberal bias, this is not a preconceived notion that I am suggesting here. This is not about intuitions or impressions, although I know that those can go in many different directions. This is about what the data actually suggests. The data actually do indicate that right-wing content is more amplified on these social media platforms than left-wing content, and that right-wing content is more disproportionately associated with real-world violence. Not hurt feelings, not people being upset, but in fact actual violence, actual armed insurrections, actual notions of terrorism and anarchy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Ossoff, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. O'Neill, based upon your experience reviewing the algorithms underpinning many of these platforms and similar products, can you please connect the dots for the committee, the link between the scale that these companies manage to achieve and the algorithms that they use to feed content to targeted users?
Thank you for your question. I'm going to make a confession. I haven't audited these algorithms because these companies have not welcomed me or invited me to inside their systems. They would not want me there. And for that matter, I don't think I would take that job for the very reason you're asking the question. As an algorithmic auditor, I want to consider who would be harmed, who are the stakeholders, and what kind of harm would come to those stakeholders or might come to those stakeholders. I don't go in assuming there's harm, but I do go in thinking about who are the stakeholders and what could harm them, and then making and developing tests and experiments to see the extent to which these harms are actually occurring. So for example, the kind of research we learned about from the whistleblower around teenage girls and suicidal ideation would be the stakeholder, teenage girls, and the harm would be suicidal ideation caused by their experiences on Instagram. That would be an example of the kind of stakeholder and harm that I would examine. But if I were to actually be given the job of auditing the Facebook algorithm or the Instagram algorithm or any of the other algorithms, it would just be too large. There would be too many stakeholders. For example, it's very clear to me that if I had been given that job 4 years ago, I never would have imagined the stakeholder that would be the Rohingya Muslims who are going to be, there were going to be a genocide against them in Myanmar. That simply would not have occurred to me. So it's just too big a job to do that, and it's because of scale, because it's international, and because even within the United States it's too large to imagine who are the stakeholders and what kind of harm could befall them. Having said all that, there are specific stakeholders that you can imagine right now that are interested, that are the focus of this particular committee, that you could be saying, well, wait a second, are these stakeholders having these harms that are actually illegal or a national security threat? And that is the kind of algorithmic audit I would be happy to do. It would not be something that Facebook would invite me to do. You would have to somehow subpoena the data for me on my behalf, but that is something I could do. So just to summarize, auditing for me is a stakeholder and a harm and an experiment to see the extent to which that harm is falling on that stakeholder. And I'd be happy to do that, but you have to choose a few of them because there's just almost an infinite number to consider a priori.
Okay, Ms. O'Neill, thank you. Dr. Frank, having observed this hearing, paying close attention to the broader discourse in politics, culture, society on these issues, what do you think is being missed by policymakers, and how is the nature of our debate perhaps overlooking key considerations or facts relevant to the policy discussion?
Thank you. I think a lot of what is being missed is, or I should say the focus is sometimes on purposes, intentions, listening to the companies say we're working on this, we wish we had caught that. I really think it is long past time that we look beyond what the companies are saying they care about and what they're intending to do and simply look at what is happening, that the question of intentions just be something we leave in the past. And so this is why I suggest, for instance, that Section 230 is ripe for reform, because it gives too much deference to the idea that this industry will be able to regulate itself. I think the other important issue is to recognize that certain types of changes to Section 230 need not raise or settle all of the First Amendment concerns that have been brought up that are, of course, legitimate to bring up and be concerned about, that modest reforms to Section 230, for instance, denying immunity when it comes to harm that is caused, that is foreseeable, and to which intermediaries have exhibited deliberate indifference, all that would do would be to allow people to be able to sue these companies if they had a theory. It doesn't mean that they would be vindicated. It doesn't mean that some of that speech would not ultimately be found to be First Amendment protected. It means that the industry would not continue to have this kind of preferential treatment that rarely any other industry really has. They would be called to account. They would have to reveal documentation. They would give us some transparency about the inner workings of what these companies actually do. And they would allow, at least in some cases, for people who have been harmed to prevail and to actually get some kind of compensation for their injuries.
Thank you, Dr. Franks. And what information about the business practices of these firms that may not currently be public do you think would be of the greatest value to Congress as we weigh potential statutory revisions?
There are any number of things that I would particularly be interested in hearing what these companies are doing, but just to take a few examples, when companies implement policies against certain types of harms and say that they now have removal policies, let's say with non-consensual intimate imagery, what is the data in terms of what kinds of reports they're getting? What is the data in terms of whether they are taking those requests seriously? How quickly are they responding to those requests? How often are they aware that those types of material is flourishing on the platform and increasing engagement? How many times are they willing to nonetheless hold to their principles and take it down as they have said that they would? In essence, are they actually fulfilling the promises that they're making to the public?
Thank you, Dr. Franks. Thanks to the panel. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Rosen, you are now recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Chair Peters, of course, Ranking Member Portman, for holding this very timely hearing. And to our witnesses, I appreciate you being here and sharing your expertise with us. I want to talk a little bit about algorithms, because the tools of violent extremism, like conspiracy theories and disinformation, they frequently begin online as the building blocks of hate. As we've seen time and time again, hateful online words can morph into deadly offline actions, and then amplified once again online. This is a vicious cycle. This was the case 3 years ago yesterday at the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting, and it's true in far too many cases of hate. So as we've been discussing today, what often enables extremist groups and individuals to disseminate hate messaging are social media algorithms. Platforms generate algorithms that promote content, even if it's harmful, to keep people engaged. And engagement is what drives advertising revenue. We've learned recently that social media platforms have known for some time, and I'm going to quote here, hate speech, divisive political speech, and misinformation unquote, on their apps are having a negative impact on society. And that, again, I'm going to quote, the core product mechanics, such as virality, which means how viral someone goes or some post goes, those recommendation algorithms optimizing for engagement, they're a significant part of why these types of speech flourish. So as a former computer programmer, I know that platforms have the capability to remove bigoted, hateful, and incendiary content that leads to violence. And I also know that they have an obligation to do so. So to Mr. Sifri and then Ms. O'Neill, when a platform announces a new policy banning hate content, how often do you know how often do they, or should they adjust their algorithms to reduce this content? And more importantly, to reduce and remove the recommendation algorithm for hate content so they don't continue to spread like we see that?
Senator, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much. The core issue, right, that these policies that they're creating, and many of the large tech companies have, on the face of it, admirable policies against hate, against incitement to violence, and against harassment. However, the issue is enforcement at scale. And what we have seen over and over again is that the platforms are falling down at being able to enforce at scale. So, for example, for 9 years, Facebook did not have an official policy on Holocaust denial. They allowed this content to stay up on their site with no policy. Last year, after years of advocacy by civil society groups, including ADL, they finally changed their policy and said, okay, this terrible, nefarious content needs to be off the platform. Yet, in January of this year, just 3 months later, when you would expect they had time to actually enforce said policy, we went and tested that policy. We were able to find groups with tens of thousands of members that were still advocating Holocaust denial, and we were able to find these kinds of nefarious content still being pushed to the tops of people's feeds. So you are so right in the sense that not only its policies, the policies are of course important, but it's how do you enforce these policies at scale, and how these algorithms, because of these engagement mechanisms, will then push them to the top of our news feeds, right next to content from our friends and family.
Thank you. Ms. Sifri, what do you think we can do to reduce or remove these algorithms? I meant Ms. Sifri, I'm sorry, Ms. O'Neill. I'm looking at Mr. Sifri and I'm seeing you in the screen. I knew what I meant. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Yeah, it's a really, really good question. It's an important question. I personally, and probably you as well, when I heard Mark Zuckerberg say to the Senate a few years ago that AI is going to solve this problem, I knew that was a lie. And he knew that was a lie. AI does not have a notion of truth. It doesn't understand the English language, or never mind other languages. It simply looks for keywords. It's like a little bit of a gussied up version of a keyword search. It doesn't. So the point is that if we can't decide what's true, right? AI can definitely not decide what's true, and its track record is so very weak. We've been hearing about less than 1% of certain types of violent content being caught by this particular type of AI, and I hesitate to call it AI because that's giving it too much credit. It's just an algorithm that's a filter. I also just want to say that I don't have any confidence that this will work better in the future. And the reason is that whereas the propagandists are working with the recommendation engine to get more attention because they want more attention. So you can say that as like they're working with that algorithm. They're working directly against the filtering algorithm. They're trying to bypass it. And they're very good at that. And the filter is just a very weak thing. And it will never work as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I want you to go on and we think about enforcement and at scale, some of the things you're talking about. What can we do here in Congress to really be sure that we can put those guardrails there for this misinformation, hate, things that promote violence in the real world and then amplify that violence and celebrate it after it happens? What can Congress do to help stop this?
Well, I think I'm going to go back to the first person who spoke. I believe her name is Karen. That it's about incentives, right? So the thing that I suggest should happen would be for you guys to have a specific definition of the kind of harm that you want them to keep an eye out for. And then you have a way of making sure it's happening, a monitor. And every single time their monitor fails, they get charged money, because it's always going to be about money. So in other words, you have to make it more expensive for them to let it happen than the profit that they gain by letting it happen. You have to really counter the profit motive, and that is the only way you can do it. And of course, it will be very expensive for them to stop these kinds of things. It won't work with AI. They'll have to put humans on it, and they don't want to do that.
Right. Well,
And Senator, if I may,
I was going to say, Mr. Sifri, do you have something to add? Because I really want to work to stop this escalation and celebration and this vicious cycle. So please.
Absolutely. And what is so critical here is it starts with transparency. So, number one, what are the actual policies that these platforms actually have? Facebook had a policy that they never reported on called cross-check, where over 5 million people were essentially absolved from any kind of machine review. And this presented and created a virtual whitelist where celebrities, politicians, and others could say whatever they wanted without review. And then for each of the policies they have, what are the enforcements that they've done? We expect these kinds of reports when we have companies that go public and go to the SEC, and we expect it and we penalize them when they lied. We should be doing the exact same things with these companies that are so vital to the future of our democracy.
Thank you. I appreciate both. I have some other questions for the record. Mr. Chairman, I'll be submitting those. Thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Langford, you're recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Thanks for all the testimony. This is an ongoing national conversation, obviously. We don't have an anticipation we're going to solve it all today in this hearing, but we do have an anticipation we're going to narrow down what are the key things that we're going to engage in that we've got to be able to find a way to be able to solve. So it's helpful to be able to have your dialogue in the conversation. 5 years ago, I was with an executive from a Silicon Valley company, which I will leave out the name of the company. And as we were chit-chatting, I made just some random comment about his social media page. And he looked at me point blank and said, "Oh, I don't do social media at all. And my children don't do social media at all. I know better because I know what it is and what it's designed to do. I would never do that." And it was stunning to me to hear someone in the middle of Silicon Valley to say, "Oh, I know how toxic this is. There's no way I'm going to allow my children or my own family to be affected by this." For some reason, that message has not gotten out to a lot of other folks, and for some reason, there are folks that are in social media companies that have no personal challenge with being a part of that. The original sale of this seems to be we're going to swap pictures of our children and what we're eating for dinner, and it has moved to something very, very, very different. So saying all that, I want to talk a little bit about ways that it could get better, practical aspects. Some of them were just mentioned online in some of the conversation just now. What are some practical things that could be done to make this platform, this type of platform, better to be able to engage? Anyone who wants to jump in with a practical idea, you're welcome to.
Senator, if I may, so we've talked a lot about changing the algorithms and changing the incentive systems that then get these companies to change their algorithms. So I think number one, we've been looking at Section 230 reform in particular.
We're also among the first to provide access to free education for all Americans, beginning back in the late 1800s. That decision alone to invest in our children and their families was a major part of why we were able to lead the world for much of the 20th century. But somewhere along the way, we stopped investing in ourselves, investing in our people. America is still the largest economy in the world. We still have the most productive workers and the most innovative minds in the world. But we've risked losing our edge as a nation. Our infrastructure used to be rated the best in the world. Today, according to the World Economic Forum, we rank 13th in the world. We used to lead the world in educational achievement. Now the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development ranks America 35th out of the 37 major countries when it comes to investing in early childhood education and care. We know how our children start impacts significantly on how they'll finish. We can't be competitive in the 21st century global economy if we continue this slide. That's why I've said all along, we need to build America from the bottom up and the middle out, not from the top down, with the trickle-down economics that's always failed us. I can't think of a single time when the middle class has done well that the wealthy haven't done very well. I think of many times, including now, when the wealthy, the super wealthy, do very well, and the middle class don't do well. That's why I propose the investments Congress is now considering in two critical pieces of legislation. Positions I ran on as president, positions I announced when I laid out in a joint session of Congress what my economic agenda was. These are not about left versus right, or moderate versus progressive, or anything else that pits Americans against one another. This is about competitiveness versus complacency. Competitiveness versus complacency. It's about expanding opportunity, not opportunity denied. It's about leading the world or letting the world pass us by. Today, with my Democratic colleagues, we have a framework for my Build Back Better initiative. And here's how it will fundamentally change the lives of millions of people for the better. Millions of you are in the so-called sandwich generation, who feel financially squeezed by raising a child and caring for an aging parent. About 820,000 seniors in America and people with disabilities have applied for Medicaid, and they're on a waiting list right now to get home care. They need some help. They don't have to be kicked out of their homes, but they need a little help getting around, having their meals made occasionally for them. They don't want to put them in nursing homes, not because of the cost, but because it's a matter of dignity. They want to stay in their homes. But it's hard. You're just looking for an answer so your parents can keep living independently with dignity. For millions of families in America, this issue is the most important issue they're facing. It's personal. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to expand services for seniors so families can get help from well-trained, well-paid professionals to help them take care of their parents at home, to cook meals for them, to get their groceries for them, to help them get around, to help them live in their own home with the dignity they deserve to be afforded. Quite frankly, what we found is that this is more popular or as popular as anything else we're proposing because the American people understand the need. It's a matter of dignity and pride for our parents. 30 years ago, we ranked number 7 among the advanced economies in the world as a share of women working. You know where we are today? We ranked 23rd. 23rd. 7 to 23. Once again, our competitors are investing, and we're standing still. Today, there are nearly 2 million women in America not working today simply because they can't afford childcare. Typical family spends about $11,000 a year on childcare. Some states, it's $14,500 a year per child. We're going to make sure nearly all families earning less than $300,000 a year will pay no more than 7% of their income for childcare. And for a family making $100,000 a year, that will save them more than $5,000 on childcare. This is a fundamental game changer for families and for our economy, as more parents, especially women, can get back to work and work in the workforce. I'm looking at a lot of significant press people in front of me. A lot of them are working mothers. They know what it costs. I remember when I got to the Senate, I lost my wife and daughter in an accident, my 2 boys. I started commuting 250 miles a day because I had my mom and my dad and my brother and my sister to help me take care of my kids because I couldn't afford childcare, and I was getting a serious salary, $42,000 a year. We've also extended the historic middle-class tax cut. That's what I call it, middle tax cut for parents. That is the expanded child tax credit we passed through the American Rescue Plan. What that means is, for folks at home, they're getting $300 a month for every child under the age of 6, $250 for every child under the age of 18. We're extending that for another year. The money is already a life changer for so many working families. This will help cut child poverty in half this year, according to experts. But that's not all it does. It changes the whole dynamic for working parents. In the past, if you paid taxes and had a good income, you could deduct, under the tax code, $2,000 per child from the taxes you owed. But how many families do you know, a cashier, waiters, healthcare workers, who never got the benefit of the full tax credit because they didn't have that much to deduct, and it wasn't refundable? So it either came off your tax bill or you didn't get full credit. Why should somebody making $500,000 a year or $150,000 or $200,000 a year get to write it off their taxes? And the people who need the help even more, they don't have that much tax to pay. They don't get the benefit, and they have the same cost of raising their children. 80% of those left out were working parents who just didn't make enough money. That's why in the American Rescue Plan, we didn't just expand the amount of the middle-class tax cut. We also made it refundable. This framework will make it permanently refundable, making sure that the families who need it get a full credit for it, in addition to those who are already getting full credit. They're going to make sure that every 3- and 4-year-old child in America will go to high-quality preschool. That's part of the legislation I just brought up to the Congress. Studies show that when we put 3 and 4 years old in school, not daycare, school, we increase by up to 47% the chance that that child, no matter what their background, will be able to earn a college degree. As my wife Jill is in the back here, we always says, any country that out-educates us is going to out-compete us. We can finally take us from 12 years to 14 years of universal education in America. We also make investments in higher education by increasing Pell Grants to help students from lower-income families attend community colleges and 4-year schools. And we invest in historically black universities, colleges and universities, HBCUs, minority-serving institutions, and tribal colleges to make sure every young student has a shot at a good-paying job of the future. This framework extends tax credits to lower premiums for folks who are in the Affordable Care Act for another 3 years. For 4 million folks in the 12 states that haven't expanded Medicaid, all the rest have, this framework will enable you to get affordable coverage. And Medicare will now cover the cost of hearing aids and hearing checkups. This framework also makes the most significant investment to deal with the climate crisis ever happened, beyond any other advanced nation in the world. Over 1 billion metric tons of emission reductions, at least 10 times bigger on climate than any bill that has ever passed before, and enough to position us for a 50 to 52% emission reductions by the year 2030. And we'll do it in ways that grow the domestic industries, create good-paying union jobs, address long-standing environmental injustices as well. Tax credit to help people do things like weatherize their homes so they use less energy, install solar panels and develop clean energy products, and help business produce more clean energy. And when paired with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we will truly transform this nation. Historic investments in passenger rail. I know everybody says, oh, Biden's a rail guy. That's true. But passenger rail and freight rail and public transit, it's going to make take hundreds of thousands of vehicles off the road, saving millions of barrels of oil. Everybody knows, all the studies show, if you can get from point A to point B on electric rail, you won't drive your car. You'll take the rail service. We also learned that in most major cities in America, Minority populations, the jobs they used to have in town, they're now out of town. Roughly 60% of the folks, they don't have vehicles, so they need to have a means to get out of town, to their jobs, to be on time. This will do that, like it did for Detroit. 95% of the 840,000 school buses in America run on diesel. Every day, more than 25 million children and thousands of bus drivers breathe polluted air on the way to and from school from the diesel exhaust. We're going to replace thousands of these with electric school buses that have big batteries underneath and that are good for the climate. I went down to one of the manufacturing facilities, saw them, got in one, drive them. They do not expend any, expend any pollution into the air. We'll build out the first ever national network of 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations all across the country. So when you buy an electric vehicle, and you get credit for buying it, you buy an electric vehicle, you can go all the way across America on a single tank of gas, figuratively speaking. It's not gas. You plug it in. 500,000 of them, these stations along the way. We're going to get off the sidelines on manufacturing solar panels and wind farms and electric vehicles with targeted manufacturing credits. You manufacture, you get them a credit for doing it. These will help grow the supply chains in communities too often left behind. And we're going to reward countries for paying good wages, for companies, I should say, for good wages and for sourcing their materials from here in the United States. That means tens of millions of panels and turbines, doubling the number of electric vehicles we have on the road within just 3 years. We'll be able to sell and export these products and technologies to the rest of the world and creating thousands more jobs because we are once again going to be the innovators. We'll also make historic investments in environmental cleanup and remediation. That means putting people to work in good paying jobs at prevailing wage, capping hundreds of thousands of abandoned wells and gas wells, oil and gas wells, that need to be capped because they are leaking things that hurt the air. Putting a stop to the methane leaks in the pipelines, protecting the health of our communities. It's a big deal. And we'll build up our resilience for the next superstorm, drought, wildfires, and hurricanes that represent a blinking code red for America and the world. Last year alone, these types of extreme weather events you've all been covering and you've all witnessed and some of you have been caught in the middle of, have caused $99 billion in damage to the United States within the last year. $99 billion. And we're not spending any money to deal with this? It's costing us significantly. In Pittsburgh, I met an IBW electrical worker who climbs up on those power lines in the middle of a storm to try to put transformers in to keep the lights on when storms hit. He calls himself a 100% union guy. His job's dangerous. As he said, I quote, "I don't want my kids growing up in a world where the threat of climate change hangs over their heads," end of quote. Folks, we all have that obligation to our children and to our grandchildren. The bipartisan infrastructure bill is also the most significant investment since we built the interstate highway system and won the space race decades ago. This is about rebuilding the arteries of our economy. Across the country now, there are 45,000 bridges and 173,000 miles of roads that are in poor condition. Some of the bridges you don't even take a chance of going across. They're shut down. They can't be built back to the same standard because the weather's not going to get a lot better. We just got to keep from getting a heck of a lot worse. We have to build back better and stronger. No one should have to hold their breath as they cross a rundown bridge or a dangerous intersection in their hometown. We're going to put hardworking Americans on the job to bring our infrastructure up to speed. Good union jobs at prevailing wages. Jobs you can raise a family on. As my dad would say, you can have a little breathing room. Jobs that can't be outsourced. Jobs replacing lead water pipes so families can drink clean water. Improving the health of our children and putting plumbers and pipe fitters to work. Jobs laying thousands of miles of transmission lines to build a modern energy grid. Jobs making a high-speed internet affordable and available everywhere in rural and urban America, particularly including the 35% of rural America that goes without it right now. This pandemic has made clear the need for affordable and available high-speed internet. The idea of a parent having to put their kids in the car for virtual learning, drive and sit in a McDonald's parking lot so their child can access the internet when school is taught virtually is not only unnecessary, it's just wrong. It's wrong. As I said before, these plans are fiscally responsible. They are fully paid for. They don't add a single penny to the deficit. They don't raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. In fact, they reduce the deficit. Here's how. I don't want to punish anyone's success. I'm a capitalist. I want everyone to be able to, if they want to be a millionaire or billionaire, to be able to seek their goal. But all I'm asking is, pay your fair share. Pay your fair share. Pay your fair share. And right now, many of them are paying virtually nothing. Last year, the 55 most profitable corporations in America, 55 of them, paid zero in federal income tax on about $40 billion in profit. If they report big profits to their shareholders, they should be paying taxes. It's that simple. That's why the Build Back Better framework will have a 15% minimum on the largest corporations, a minimum tax of 15%. The top 1% of the wealthiest Americans evade, it's estimated by the experts, $160 billion a year in federal taxes. That's wrong. We're going to change that. I want to emphasize what I said from the beginning. Under my plans, if you earn less than $400,000, you won't pay a single penny more in federal taxes, period. In fact, these bills continue cutting taxes for middle class, for child care, for health care, so much more. Let me close with this. For much too long, working people of this nation and the middle class of this country have been dealt out of the American deal. It's time to deal them back in. I ran for president saying it was time to reduce the burden on the middle class, to rebuild the backbone of this nation, working people and the middle class. I couldn't have been any clearer from the very moment I announced my candidacy. That's why I wrote these bills in the first place and took them to the people. I campaigned on them, and the American people spoke. This agenda, the agenda that's in these bills, is what 81 million Americans voted for. More people voted than any time in American history. That's what they voted for. Their voices deserve to be heard, not denied, or worse, ignored. Because here's what I know. If we make these investments, there will be no stopping the American people or America. We will own the future. I've long said it's never been a good bet to bet against the American people. I've said that to foreign leaders as well as everyone here in this country, which means it's always a good bet to bet on the American people. Just give them half a chance. And that's what we're doing. That's what these plans do. They're about betting on America, about believing in America, about believing in the capacity of the American people. If you look at the history of the journey of this nation, what becomes crystal clear is this. I'll say it again. Given half a chance, the American people have never, ever, ever, ever let the country down. So let's get this done. God bless you all, and may God protect your troops, and I'll see you in Italy and in Scotland. Thank you.
Manchin and Sinema agree to this.
Are you relying on? Do you have a firm
or extreme content are essentially keyword searches. So you need to understand what keywords to search for. So you need a lot of experts working full time on this, and they just simply don't want to pay for that. And it would be very expensive, so it's clear. But I just want to make it also clear that there's no simple solution. I'm not suggesting that they're avoiding doing something simple to solve these problems. This is actually really, really hard. Their mistake is not that they aren't doing it well, it's that they're pretending they can do it. They simply cannot do it because of what I've said before, that AI doesn't understand truth. So it's just simply looking for keywords. So to the extent that Facebook cares about looking good, they care much more about looking good to English-speaking Americans and to people like you. I will just say one quick story. I gave a talk in the Ukraine recently, and one of the audience members was a parliament member of the Ukraine, and she said, "What can we do here in the Ukraine about the Russian propaganda that undermines people's trust in our elections?" And I was like, wow, I really don't know. I mean, you have even less power over Facebook than the senators in the United States Senate. So it is a really important question.
I'll just add to your commentary about looking good in front of Americans, or looking good in front of people like us, members of the United States Senate. Sadly, looking good in front of investors and Wall Street seems to trump it all. And my final question, the time remaining, we know today's information ecosystem is complex. In addition to facing organized propaganda campaigns, social media users encounter more content at higher speeds, right? The innovation in technology has a role to play here. And I worry that efforts to help communities critically engage with information is not keeping pace. It's also not lost on me that we've seen an explosion of propaganda campaigns aimed at manipulating and intimidating communities online while we're in the midst of a collapse of local journalism and independent media. So my final question is for Ambassador Kornblum.
Real quick, guys, cutting social media. I'm going to bring up the Racine County Sheriff's Office, who's holding a press conference about election integrity. Obviously, we can't show this on social media, so I'm going to cut all of my, actually, you know what I'll do? I'll cut YouTube. And so I'll stay live everywhere else, but I'm going to cut YouTube right now. Go to Rumble, guys. I stream 24/7 to Rumble. Look up Citizen Stringer on Rumble and you'll be able to see it, but I'm cutting YouTube right now.